Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Diane Perez, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Multiple Pathways for Recovery. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the Q&A panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions at the end of the presentation. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options will be posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 10 business days. To access the recording, go to www.fada.org. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to participants within the similar time frame. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as part of the registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 10 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Thursday, April 25th. 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. Note, please, that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. I now would like to introduce our presenter, Tom Hill. Tom Hill began at the National Council for Behavioral Health in March of 2017 and currently serving as Vice President of Practice Improvement. Tom previously served as a presidential appointee in the position of Senior Advisor on Addiction and Recovery to the SAMHSA Administrator. As part of this post, Tom initially served as acting director of the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. Prior to this appointment, he was senior associate at Altram Institute, serving as technical assistant director for a number of SAMHSA treatment and recovery support grant initiatives. He also served for 4 years as director of programs at Faces and Voices of Recovery. Reflecting his commitment to the goal of long-term recovery for individuals, families, and communities, Tom has also served on numerous boards of directors, advisory boards, committees, task force, and working groups. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Johnson Institute America Honors Recovery Award, the National Association of Lesbian and Gay Addiction Professionals Advocacy Award, and a Robert Wood Johnson Fellowship in the Developing Leadership in Reducing Substance Abuse Initiative. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Tom Hill.
In Florida and other places. It's certainly a beautiful morning in Washington, D.C. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Diane, and for the invitation to be able to come forward today and talk about something that's really, really near and dear to my heart. I am a person in long-term recovery from addiction, which means I haven't used alcohol or drugs in 27 years, and I owe a lot of that journey to other people and support systems along the way, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that today. So let's get started. One of the things that we need to talk about just for CEUs and whatnot is, hold on. Okay. The learning objectives today, we're going to talk about expanding the continuum of care in a way that institutionalizes recovery supports. We're going to identify various components that make up a well-formed recovery ecology, and we'll talk what that is. And then we'll understand a diverse range of formal and informal recovery pathways. So let me start off with a little story, and maybe some of you have heard this before. It's talked often by a man named Don Koyas, who's been a long-term mentor of mine in recovery. He's the founder of an organization called White Bison, and White Bison is an organization that mainly deals with recovery in Indian country across the United States and Canada, and one of the things they talk about is they coined the term wellbriety, and that's a combination of sobriety and wellbriety and wellness that they thought was really good in a cultural context. And even though a lot of the teachings of White Bison are very specific to Native American culture, there's a lot of cultural applicability across various different cultures and settings that I think are worth noting. So the story of the healing forest starts with you have a sick tree, so you're trying to diagnose this and decide what's wrong with it, and so you dig it up and you put it in the back of a truck and you drive the truck to a hospital and or a health clinic, and it gets good care and good medicine and a time for recuperation and replenishment, and it gets better. And so it gets released from the hospital. They put it back in the truck. They drive the truck back to the forest. They plant it in the hole that it was dug from. They pat the earth around it, and then they find out it gets sick again. And all that expense and health care and attention was for naught, because when you put it back into the soil, you have a chance to look at it in a different way. And so you think, well, maybe it's the soil. Maybe the forest is sick. And so maybe we need to pay attention to the individual tree, but we also need to pay attention to the entire forest. So Don talks about this in the context of Native American culture, like I said, And so one of the things he draws to is that that if you look at the soil, and if there's secrets, if there's things that aren't being talked about, if there's shame and anger and guilt and fear that's not being brought to the light of day, then it creates a sickness in the forest. And bad soil and bad nutrients in the soil, or lack of nutrients, are going to make sick trees and a sick forest. So when he talks about that in terms of Indian country, he's talking about, years of cultural and intergenerational trauma. He's talking about things that have been failed to be passed down from generation to generation in terms of keeping the culture alive and well and happy. So as a result, you have things that are happening in that particular culture, but I think they're happening in all cultures. You have all of these sort of cultural and social issues that are popping up in individuals, families, and communities. You have alcohol and drugs, and we talk about that a lot. We now talk about health disparities. In recent years, we've really talked a lot more about trauma and how individual and cultural trauma can affect a human being. We talked about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and their direct relation with mental illness and addiction. We talked about child and sexual abuse. We have rising rates of violence. We have rising rates of suicide. Like, all of these things are attributes of the bad soil. And so what he starts talking about is to do healing, to have a healing forest, we have to start by addressing how we can start to achieve better and nutritious soil. So I think that's a very powerful analogy. And so I, with Don's permission and with the permission of William White, and because Bill talks a lot about recovery ecologies and this need to have, this network of rich recovery resources in communities that can help people thrive and survive and flourish in their recovery, and an idea of what that looks like. So with their permission, I conflated the two things and turned the healing forest into a recovery ecology. And so the idea here is you start changing the soil. You have fertile soil, you have good potent seeds, you have clean water, you have fresh air, and you start to develop new trees that can be resources of recovery in the community. So, for years what happened was people would go to treatments. When they would come back from that hospital and go to the forest, they would basically have 12-step programs, right? That was the sort of lone pathway for a long, long time. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But, 12-step programs come under the topic of mutual aid because now there's a whole variety of mutual aid programs that include 12 steps, but also include a lot of other types of mutual aid groups. But the other idea of this is how rich a vision can we start to support in terms of what needs to be on the ground to help any given person support their recovery short-term and long-term. So for years we've talked about all these various things. We've talked about recovery housing, that people often need a safe, affordable place to live, and we know that living in a group environment with other people that are practicing recovery is really, really helpful and conducive to a short-term and also long-term recovery. We talked about collegiate recovery programs and recovery high schools. Those are certainly flourishing across the country, really necessary, especially for young people, to develop a healthy environment and healthy cohorts to support their recovery. We have recovery fitness centers. We have things like Phoenix Multisport, Fit to Recover, various programs where it connects physical exercise and nutrition with people's individual and collective recovery. We have recovery reentry programs where people are coming back from incarceration, jail, or prison in ways and programs that can help support their recovery and also reduce recidivism. We have recovery ministries. We have recovery congregations and recovery churches and recovery synagogues sprouting up around the country. Legal assistance is a huge, huge issue for so many people connected to the recovery reentry of people who have rap sheets that are and criminal records that they're blockading and creating lack of access to recovery supports. We have family support and education. The family movement has really grown a lot lately, largely because of the opioid epidemic, where many, many parents have lost children and not only need support and education, but want to give back to the community in a new way. So that's a new, not a new resource, but certainly a re-energized resource that's being revitalized across the country. And then we have harm reduction, which is we're going to talk about a little bit later also, which is sort of meeting people where they're at and helping people achieve wellness and absence recovery if they want and if they're able to. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then peer support, which has just grown exponentially over the years to be a really vital part of the workforce, but also really grounded in communities and often in recovery community centers, which are another institution that have popped up across the country, much like senior centers. And we would love to see recovery community centers everywhere where recovery can be vital in the community, hang out a shingle on Main Street, and be the hub for a lot of recovery activities and a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So that's sort of the vision about what a recovery ecology could be. And imagine if all of these programs and resources were connected in a way that formed a beautiful web that would catch people as sort of a safety net and ensure that they could have a rich and vital recovery that the community would be accountable for and they would be accountable to in the community. So that's the vision. And then just to take it a little, one step further is outside of all of that is to develop this culture of recovery. And you know, as recovery has become a much more understood and accepted term and really a viable answer to addiction, that people actually can see it now. You know, it's hidden for so long. There's recovery advocates. People are much more open about their recovery. Young people are way more open about their recovery. That we also can develop this consciousness about recovery in and beyond our community. So that culture would include art and music and media, language, recovery enterprises, social entrepreneurship, the exchange of stories and history. Recovery rituals would become codified in the community, symbols of recovery, and just a general idea about health and wellness. And as we start talking about community and sanctuary and wholeness and healing in those four corners, it's not just for people that are in recovery from addiction. It's not just people who are practicing absence-based recovery. It's something for everybody, and it's something for everybody to aspire to in our culture in a way that really has not been present and visible and vocal before. So I think we're on the cusp of really being able to develop something that we've never dreamed of before, but could really be an answer to a lot of issues when we talk about substance use and addiction. And I didn't talk about prevention, and prevention is such a huge piece of all of this. And I believe that recovery and prevention can be linked in ways that we haven't even started to imagine yet. So that recovery prevention can be a part of recovery and vice versa. So we're going to pause for a minute, and we're going to ask a question, and you can type these in the chat box. And I would say I would actually cast this a little differently. What key elements of a recovery ecology are currently missing from your community that you would like to see in your community? So if they're not there yet, but it's one of the things that I mentioned, or maybe something that I didn't mention, that you would like to see pop up in your community as a way to have a more rich resource or set of resources in your community. so you can start typing in some of the things that, and as you do that, and Diane, I can't see anybody typing in, so if you can, you can just let us know.
Okay, yes, I am able to see recovery housing is a huge need in my community. Empathy from clinicians. I would like to personally see community centers pop up. Hearing that idea energized me. We have most for the specific needs and support of women. Environmental location of recovery, transitional housing, community support. What else here? We are very rural and not a lot of resources available. More for women, recovery cafe, resource center, housing, legal assistance, art and music, stories, plays, media, health and wellness, housing, a big need. More recovery events in the community. Housing for families, lack of housing for ex-felons with violent offense. Recovery houses for families which also accept MAT treatment. Providers specific for substance recovery, resources for teens. We have, my community doesn't focus on recovery. We have local 12-step and celebrate recovery, but aside from that, you have to go out of the community to support recovery, and then recovering for all.
So those are all, those are great answers, and answers that I would not find surprising. I think I hear housing a lot, and of course we know that there's, the need for a safe and secure place for people, especially in early recovery. We need housing for specifically for women. We need housing specifically for families. And all of that comes under the advocacy piece of really working with. I know you have FAR, which is the Florida Alliance of Recovery Residences, which is a part of NAR, which is the National Alliance of Recovery Residences, to have housing that is accessible and safe and applicable. Housing that accepts medication-assisted treatment and medication-assisted recovery specifically, and we have just put out a field guide for recovery house operators. We did it with NAR and the Center for Social Innovation to help recovery operators understand medication, what it is and what it isn't, and to really start a culture shift in our recovery community to talk about medication in a new way. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But I also, I think stuff for adolescents, that's why the collegiate recovery program and recovery high schools is so important, but also programs specific to adolescents and young people. I see cultural diversity, and I think that's always a huge issue, that we're inclusive and we embrace all cultures in every aspect of what we're doing here, so that we don't leave anybody behind. So the rural thing, I think, continues to be an issue in general as we try to figure out how to build up recovery capital and recovery ecologies in those communities. So we can talk about this for a long, long time. We could spend a whole session talking about recovery housing and recovery supports in different kinds of geographical settings. But thank you, because I think these are all really pertinent issues, and thanks to FLAG, and thanks for you to think about as you are helping to develop what some of these could look like in your own community. I'm going to move on, and we can move back to these later if we have time. But I'm really just thrilled to hear your responses and to know that you're thinking about this in a very, very real way. I also see, just before I move on to the next slide, the whole idea of language and Spanish speaking is, I think, a huge lift in terms of where we need to go. And I think in cultural diversity in general, about who we represent, needs to be always front and center, who gets included, and how we make the adjustments we need to make in order to create a big tent that includes everybody and doesn't leave anybody behind, as I said before. I'm going to move on, and like I said, we can come back if we have time. So we talked about this recovery ecology, and so I wanted to talk about this continuum of recovery. And this was developed by William White, and I added this continuum of care. So the pre-recovery engagement, pre-recovery initiation and stabilization, pre and early recovery, recovery maintenance, and then leading into long-term recovery. And so when we think about when people go to treatment, that usually is the recovery initiation and stabilization, moving into overlapping with recovery maintenance, and then what happens when people leave treatment or come back from incarceration and go back to the community? What happens during the recovery maintenance, blending into long-term recovery? And that's the area we're really talking about. And so if we think about pre-recovery engagement, it's sort of the pre-contemplation in the stages of change. But there's places for engagement during that time where people may be considering, people may be seeking out harm reduction, people may be contemplating wellness and any positive change in a different way. And we always say meeting people where they're at, and something I've learned recently is and don't leave them there. So you meet people where they're at and you don't leave them there. You pull them along to the next place that they're capable and willing and wanting to go to. So the idea of when people go to treatment is when they can go to really wonderful, successful treatment, and if they leave treatment, in the past people said, here's your certification of completion, avoid slippery people, places, and things, go to meetings, and you'll do fine. And what we found was not everybody did fine. When people left treatment and went into communities that were ill-equipped to support their recovery, they often either got stagnant or they got stuck, or they relapsed, or various things happened because their recovery wasn't supported. So when we look down at the bottom, the continuum of care, and we sort of stretch that out to meet the continuum of recovery, we have recovery supports that are brand new. Well, they're not brand new. They've been around for a long time, but they've been rethought in recent years. When we talk about recovery-oriented systems of care, it connects treatment to recovery support so that people land safely and have a soft landing in the community rather than, have a hard landing on their butt and are feeling the smart for that and looking around and just not seeing the support. So it's not a new way of looking at things, but it's a continuum that's been stretched out beyond treatment, and the other piece of that is episodes of treatment are usually very short as opposed to long-term recovery, which is over a lifespan. So that's sort of the context in which we're going to talk about some of this stuff today. What SAMHSA's working definition of recovery, most of us know this. It was penned in 2011, a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And then these guiding principles. And so, if people leave treatment into the kind of community I was talking about, where's the hope? And if there's not a network of resources that offer hope and offer a variety, a menu of different resources that people can pick and choose from, that's the ultimate, that's the aspirational goal. We talk about respect. We talk about building on people's strengths and not so much on their deficits. We always talk about addressing trauma now because we know it's front and center with so many people's lived experience. We've talked about cultural diversity, which came up a lot in the chat box. The recognition that people's lived experience is also grounded in their cultural experience, both in their families, in their religion, in their communities. All those things are key aspects and strengths of a person's identity. The recovery is relational, that we build everything on relationships, that the relationships are so important in terms of peer engagement, in terms of helping people through early recovery, connecting them through with relational support, and also with peer support, as I said. Holistic, that people start developing a holistic framework for wellness and what that means in terms of not only being absent from substances, but connecting to other social services and health services that can make them better and whole. The whole issue of this webinar is many pathways, so we're going to talk about that. And then person-driven, that recovery is self-determined and that people have choices along the way, and that those choices may change over time from short-term to long-term recovery. So I referred to recovery capital earlier. I think it's a fairly common term, but it's still, a newly emerging term in terms of its widespread use. But, the definition is the sum of strengths and supports that are both internal to a person and external, that are available to help them initiate and sustain long-term recovery. So when you think about it, it's like the personal supports may be you're employable, you have a college education, you have a sense of self-knowledge and introspection, you are capable of seeing things through, of setting goals and attaining them. External could be you have a recovery community that embraces you. You have a strong family life of support. You have some money in the bank. You have maybe you have some college education. It's a combination of those things, and people can have low recovery capital and high recovery capital, and so many people come in with low recovery capital and high index severity for addiction, and those are the people that really need that array of supports and recovery pathways that we talked about. And that's where that choice thing comes in so much, because one size is not going to fit all, and people are going to need specific things to their experience, and they're going to need specific things at specific times in their life. So there's a lot you can read about recovery capital. There's a lot of articles on it. William Wright's written a lot about it, and it's worth investigation. So the thing that for so many of us that have experienced active addiction, we know that substance use disorders can deplete recovery capital. So many of our folks have limited education, many dropping out of high school, not fulfilling any kind of educational goal, minimal or spotty work history, either low income or no income. So many people, at least 85% of people have a criminal background, poor rental history, bad credit, unstable family history, inadequate health care. So a lot of folks come with a lot of low recovery capital that's been depleted because of their experience of active or chronic addiction. And so we know that there are things that need to be addressed, right? And so we know that people need a safe and affordable place to live. You have talked about it in the chat box of housing, and housing specific to people's lived experience. The second most biggest issue is steady employment and job readiness. So it's not only that people need an income and they need some money coming in and they need some kind of stable employment, but a lot of folks, because of the things I talked about in the previous slide, haven't had a career-building or resume-building life. And so they often need help with those kinds of things, as well as just sort of job skills. And so education and vocational skills become key to steady employment. People need life and recovery skills. So it's like there's things that we missed along the way that we just, we're not paying attention to in terms of how to balance a checkbook, how to cook a meal, how to, just do basic things on the Maslow's scale that will help us prosper into short-term and long recovery. Health and wellness, I always talk about the fact that I didn't go to a dentist for 30 years, and I also didn't go to a doctor for 20 years. So I had lots of issues because I didn't have preventative medicine. And so, just going back to a dentist, walking through my shame of having bad teeth and going to a dentist, all those things I needed support around, as well as some insurance to help me out. We talk about the last three are really, what people need in terms of belonging to a recovery community or some kind of community of support, that we have support networks, that there's a sense of belonging and purpose, and I would say accountability to self and others in that, and then the idea of community and civic engagement, that so many of us we're not part of the political or social machine in society, and so to re-engage in that, to become voters, to become, model employees, to become things that we can take pride in that level of engagement is really important. So, we talked about those things, but some of the common sticking points are often that people have legal issues. We talked about, rap sheets and criminal records that need to be expunged. People have bad finances, they have debt, taxes, back taxes, trouble budgeting, those kinds of things. Restoring revoked license, so many people's driver's license have been taken away. Business and professional licenses from hairstylists and barber licenses to doctors and nursing licenses. Regaining custody of children is huge for everyone, certainly for women, in terms of getting their kids back from custody is a huge part of early recovery. Developing relationships and parenting skills that will help people regain custody of children, but also be responsible parents and family members. And then, as I've said over and over again, developing recovery support networks and community connections. That most of us don't do this alone, that we need this connection, we need this sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves, and to have this community infrastructure that we can walk into and feel supported. So we talked about Recovery Capital a little while ago, and so these are just 10 of the domains, and they figure right into what I've been talking about. So the first one is substance use and abstinence, and there's an assessment that you can help people figure out the Recovery Capital, and that's listed as a resource at the end. Mental wellness and spirituality, physical and mental health, citizen and community involvement, all things that we talked about in the bullet points earlier, helping people figure out what meaningful activities look like in their life, not only with a job, but with hobbies and volunteerism. Relationships and social networks, like I said, so important that people are part of this network. Housing and safety, risk-taking and independence from legal responsibilities and institutions, coping and life functioning, and recovery experience. And I think we talked about all of these 10 things in the previous slides, but this is just a way of setting out some domains and helping people even self-assess where they are in these 10 domains to figure out how they can put some recovery program together. So through all of this, and through a lot of the recovery advocacy that I've done, we have sort of, come up with some very basic, bare bones principles and values. And so the first one is really primacy of recovery, that a person's recovery is first and foremost, is often the most important thing in their life, especially in early recovery, and demands a lot of attention, but also a lot of value, that, that we as a society don't really know how to value a person's experience with recovery. I think we're learning, and people in recovery are teaching us how to do that, but we're on a learning curve with that. But that primacy is so key. The authenticity of lived experience. And I always say that lived experience is lived expertise, that people are experts in their own lives, and that they're also, because of that, able to be experts on addiction and recovery as they know it. And that, again, I think that we have always made room in our field for lived experience, but I think we're making a different kind of room now, and understanding that wherever and whenever decisions are made in our field, in our services, in our systems, that we need to have people with lived experience at the table in order to weigh in on how that affects recovery and the life of the recovery community. Diversity and inclusion, that cultural piece has been brought up, so important, because people's whole self is brought in. And I think we're also, slowly trying to figure out how to adapt all of the work we've done in a way that is inclusive culturally and does value the gifts and opportunities that people and their various cultural attributes bring in. Multiple pathways, that's key. That's key that there's more than one, and that there's ideally, aspirationally, a menu of supports that will promote people's sense of choice and sound judgment. Leadership development, I throw in there because I think everybody in recovery is a potential leader, and I think that we oftentimes, because of all of the low recovery capital stuff we talked about, a lot of folks don't even see their own leadership potential. And to help people sort of understand that and consciously lift people up a leadership ladder so that they can, feel a part of being able to lead something in their own life, as well as to help people develop their own sense of self. And then participatory process is really nothing about us without us, that people with lived experience, people in recovery, people from various cultures need to be a part of the process of any program that's being developed from inception to evaluation. And when you bring in those diverse voices and you bring in that lived experience, you will have such a rich product that you would never had if you hadn't brought them in. And we've seen that time and time again, that the more diverse voices that are brought in to participate, the better the end product will be over and over again. So I thought it was sort of good before we start to talk about what some of the pathways were, to talk about some working assumptions. And so, I think some of these are givens, right? So a set of replacements is initially necessary. And when I say a set of replacements, I mean people, places, and things. The things I talked about when they told you to leave treatment, to avoid slippery people, places, and things. It's not just avoiding them; it's replacing them with conducive people, places, and things, with people and places and things that will support your recovery. So it's a both and. So for many people, we have to give up our old friendship networks. Sometimes we have to break ties with our family. So, we have to break ties with cohort groups and systems that are not conducive to our recovery, that are not nurturing of our recovery, especially in early recovery. And you need to replace that with recovery-conducive networks. So I've said this again and again, cannot say it enough, that it's really important that that you don't just give something up, you replace it. Like you just don't give up alcohol and drugs, you replace it with a new set of skills and a new life. So the second one, I don't need to talk about anymore. Recovery flourishes in community. That's just a given. There are some people who can probably do it on their own, but I've never known a single one of them. That doesn't say they don't exist, but everyone that I know in recovery has been part of, connected to some larger community. Informed choices help determine recovery pathways. So, I think if we only have one pathway, then nobody has a choice. And to help people understand what the various choices are, so that they can have information on all those pathways and decide that they're going to try out this one instead of that one. Or maybe they're going to try out this one and that one. But that they have a choice in designing what this network, what this map looks like in a way that calls on their strengths and calls on their willingness to try something new. So the fourth one is that recovery is a long-term and ongoing process. And so, like I've said, pathways change. That just happens in the course of life anyway. But if somebody puts together more recovery time, their definition of what they need at that given moment may change drastically. And then something may happen and they may re-engage in something again after not engaging in it for a number of years. So it's a personal process, and I think it changes all the time. And then, that recovery is evolutionary, that it evolves and ebbs and flows just like all the other courses of life. And so as people engage in life in a new way, they're definitely evolving into a new being, and hopefully evolving into a better and more conscious being as their recovery develops. So I said earlier that one size does not fit all, and I think one of the, there's a number of variables here, and it's, demographics and personal background, what your lived experience looks like, how you define your lived experience, how you define your recovery, completely a personal thing, and how you define health and wellness for yourself. So we talked earlier about, harm reduction. Some people may move toward abstinence, and some people may not. And that we have to have an open mind for how we look at this, that if somebody makes some kind of positive change and it is on an evolutionary path, then maybe that's enough. And if nothing else, it's enough for right now. We talked about recovery capital skills. So people are going to fall in all areas, either high recovery capital or low recovery capital. And, a lot of that is going to be determined by culture. It's going to be determined by privilege. It's going to be determined by socioeconomic status. And those are all pieces of what we talked about earlier, the demographics. The varieties of lived experience, I said people bring in their authentic self as where they are right now. People's personal style, preference, and choice. If people, recovery is not coercive, and people need to have the opportunity to make choices and have those choices made available to them. And then whatever cultural and community norms are existing at the time that is affecting that person or that family or that community's experience of recovery. So, oftentimes we start with Alcoholics Anonymous because it's been around since 1935. And for a long time, Alcoholics Anonymous and then Narcotics Anonymous were the only game in town, and in many places they're still the only game in town. So, there's not just AA and NA. There's more than 45 other groups that focus on individual and family-related addiction in a 12-step context, in that framework. So that's really important to know. It's a very widespread, accessible thing. The history and evolution of AA is very interesting. We're not going to go into that, but it's a really important thing to know that it's been around for a long time. It's very easily accessible. Anybody can walk in Anybody can partake. It's very egalitarian. It doesn't cost anything. And then the effect it's had on society is really interesting to look at, because so many people that don't know much about recovery, they think AA equals recovery. And they, what we need to help people understand is that recovery also equals AA. That recovery is much bigger than AA, but that Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are very important, but they're not the only game in town. So, the best of 12-step groups is that it gives recovery in bite sizes. You can chunk it out. It's got steps. You can go to meetings. You can partake in as little or much as you want to in terms of there's no hard line commitments. There's an emphasis on self-reflection and looking at the past and looking at yourself and looking at everything you bring to the equation in a way that many people have not done before. So it gives it gives that sense, which is also for many people a spiritual connection also. There's sharing through personal storytelling, and this has been part of AA culture from the beginning. The rest of society has sort of caught up with storytelling as a means to convey information and share resources, but it's been around 12-step culture for a really, really long time. I talked about leadership development as being really an important piece, and leadership development is available to anybody who comes to the door of 12-step programs. They can take service commitments, they can share meetings. There's usually parameters with that, but it encourages people to participate through service, but also to develop leadership skills, to keep meetings going, to keep continuity. And once again, it's that sense of belonging, connection to community. People feel like, ideally, will feel a family-like connection with their home group or with other groups that they go to do meetings with, that there's a sense of commonality and culture that everybody shares. Limitations, the overriding perceptions from society is that it's rigid, it's cult-like, it's religious, it's exclusionary. All those things are perceptions that are sometimes based on fact with some specific groups, but shouldn't be looked at lightly, but also shouldn't be dwelt on too harshly. Like any kind of society, any kind of informal collection of people, you're going to have those kinds of issues that pop up, and then you're going to have those kinds of overall perceptions. There's insular attitudes based on cultural dominance. Many groups are very Christian-oriented, although they're supposed to be open-ended. They're sometimes, in the past, they've been very male-dominated. That probably still can happen in certain meetings and in certain areas. They've been perceived as being overly white. I think that's true in some areas and not true in other areas. Another limitation is that they don't work for everybody, and that people shouldn't say, well, if you failed AA or you failed NA or you failed a 12-step group, as opposed to maybe that group failed you, or maybe no one's at fault at all. Sometimes it's just not a good fit. And so, people shouldn't be blamed for not doing 12-step the right way. The alternative is to have other resources available. So if that's not a good fit, that there's other places to go. And then with Narcotics Anonymous, there's been a history of excluding people on medication. Their national policy has changed somewhat over the years. When I say medication, I mean medication-assisted treatment, specifically methadone and buprenorphine. That is still true to a certain extent, both on a policy level, but it also plays out on a community and individual meeting and individual member level. So, hold on a second. So, if 12-step was the beginning, and AA and NA were the beginning, also because it didn't fit for everybody, other groups started popping up. So Women for Sobriety popped up to be specific to women, to have a safe space for women to do their recovery program. Smart Recovery was a reaction to AA that it's more rational, less spiritual. And these groups have sort of flourished over the years and become their own entities. There's also Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian-based recovery program. There's Refuge Recovery, which is a Buddhist-based that's gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 years. Rebel Recovery is a program that combines both people in abstinence and harm reduction. There's one in Florida, there's one in St. Louis. It's a growing entity also, especially with young people. And then you have the South Florida Wellness Network. So there's growing alternatives everywhere. But when we go back to that recovery ecology, how many of these choices are available in specific communities? And if they're not, is there impetus to start bringing some of this mutual aid support as a beginning of building the foundation for the recovery ecologies that we talked about from the very beginning? These groups are all free. So to be able to pull them in and start seeding some new meetings may be a way to get that recovery ecology started and get more choices out there for more people. So, we talked about treatment, which is a very important pathway to recovery. And so, the thing I said earlier is treatment is episodic. It's not, it has a beginning, middle, and end. And that's something to, but it may happen from time to time. There may be several treatment episodes that are part of somebody's recovery journey. So it's important to remember that, and to remember that in a very destigmatizing, deshaming way, is that people may need to return to treatment one or two or several times in order to complete their recovery or to initiate their recovery. There's multiple pathways to treatment. So, there's as many different kinds of treatment as there are recovery pathways. And we often think that, residential treatment is what's necessary, and it's not necessarily true. For a lot of people, intensive inpatient or outpatient and outpatient treatment is a way that they can continue engaging in treatment without disrupting their life, and also at the same time be starting to engage in other recovery supports. The other bottom line is that not everyone in recovery receives treatment. A lot of us didn't go to treatment. A lot of us went right into recovery programs. And so it's important to know that the treatment isn't a required recovery pathway, and that has not been a choice for everybody, or has not been made a choice for everybody. The other things, we talked about treatment. We talked about recovery capital and treatment plans as opposed to recovery plans. Important to understand, just because when you're in treatment, you're working with professional counselors, you're working with a professional agency, and so the treatment plan is much more collaborative, ideally, but it's something that doesn't necessarily belong to the client or the person. Whereas a recovery plan, usually done in peer programs and recovery community centers, is something that is solely owned by the person in recovery. It's not on file. If it is, they have access to it. They can change it whenever they want. They can change their recovery goals in there. They can up their recovery capital. All those things are really important. So it's this sort of movement between treatment and recovery supports. It's important to know that there are lanes that people can stay in, and that each lane has its own purpose as a recovery pathway. And then, just the outcomes. So a lot of times people have said, well, we don't know what recovery outcomes are. And so I always think, well, what's a treatment outcome? It's like, is a good treatment outcome that somebody completes treatment? Because we don't have a very good way of gauging short-term, much less long-term outcomes in terms of what people's lives look like when they leave treatment and when they engage in recovery support services. when they switch pathways, how does that affect the quality of their recovery and the quality of their lives? And how do we clock that? And I think we're still trying to figure that out, and we're still, on a learning curve of being able to identify what good recovery outcomes look like and how we can start clocking them. So we talked about medication-assisted treatment, and we talked about medication-assisted treatment a lot, not in this webinar, but a lot in our work and in our lives as we've sort of delved into the opioid epidemic, the overdose epidemic, and we talked about the importance of medication as life-saving, and that it's evidence-based practice, right? So the thing about medication-assisted recovery, and that's a fairly new term that's being coined, is that there's been a real disconnect between how people think about absence-based recovery and medication, and they usually pit one against the other. And so many people have started to think that, if you are taking medication for an opioid that is prescribed by your doctor, whether it's methadone, which is agonist, which is buprenorphine, which is partial agonist, or naltrexone, which is non-agonist. If you think about, the stigma has always come from methadone and then Suboxone because they're opioid-based. And so people say, well, you're getting high, or it's fake recovery, and it's not abstinence-based. And so people have been arguing that if you're taking medication, you're working on the dose with your medical professional, you're following doctor's orders, and you're not doing any other mind-altering substance, then you're practicing medication-assisted recovery, which is abstinence-based. And that's a very different way of framing it that I think hopefully will help people that are in recovery that are practicing, are using medication. Because there's been a history, I talked about Narcotics Anonymous, there's been a history of people on medication being excluded from 12-step groups. There's been a history of people being misunderstood and told that they were not in recovery. And people's lives have really suffered as a result of that. And I think we have a chance, and we talked about many pathways, to sort of right some wrongs and pull in. We talked about cultural exclusion, that we start pulling in people who have been using medication either recently or for years in a way, that we pull them into our community and support and embrace them. And I think we have a moral obligation to that, and I also think it enriches our recovery community when we do that. So we talked about the three-legged stool. We talked about medication, plus psychosocial counseling, plus recovery supports. And those make good, strong recovery, right? And it's the recovery supports that people who have been dislocated from community now are able to feel that community connection is so, so important for them, for their lives, and for their recovery. So we talked about MAR equals absence. There's now some medication-assisted recovery 12-step groups. So some groups that are specific to the 12-step framework that accept medication. And then there's the MARS programs, the medication-assisted recovery services programs that started in the Bronx by Walter Ginter and are all over the country now as a way of developing peer supports that are specific to medication-assisted recovery. So I think that's probably a good time for a break. We've talked a lot. I've talked a lot. We'll come back to a couple more slides, and then we'll come back to a discussion question, and then we'll finish things up. So if people want to take a bio break, get up and stretch, get a drink of water, do whatever you need to do, and come back at 11:10 in 5 minutes, that would be really, really great.
Thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and take that 5-minute break.
We ready to start?
Yes. Tom, would you like to begin?
Welcome back, everybody. So I think before I move on from this slide, I just, I see a couple comments in, and I think that, this is a really heavy lift. And I think that it's something, I've been doing recovery work for 20 years, and I've seen a slow and steady change around acceptance for medication, specifically around methadone and buprenorphine. I think we have a long, long way to go. And, I will also reference that publication I talked about at the beginning that we put out with NAR and the Center for Social Innovation on recovery, medication-assisted recovery for recovery house operators, because a lot of the recovery houses have traditionally been 12-step culture. And so they've been very exclusionary toward people on medication. And so, what we did was we tried to make a toolkit for them to educate them about what medication was and what it wasn't, that what medication-assisted recovery was, and its effect on somebody maintaining an abstinence-based recovery lifestyle that would fit into the program of their house, because recovery houses need to be abstinent. And then finally, tips that they could do in terms of safeguarding the medication in their household and eliminating or reducing diversion, and ways that they could safeguard against that. So, I think these are really, really important things, and I think we have to be patient, but we have to constantly educate people that what they learned was wrong, and that what they learned is excluding people and possibly killing people. And I think we have to sometimes be that drastic and that graphic about things, because people are dying in alarming rates every day, and we have an obligation to save their lives. And we have the means from which to save their lives. So with that, I'm going to move into the harm reduction slide. And I have to... Okay, before we get there, we're going to talk about, we have a question, what obstacles still exist for individuals using medication as part of their recovery? So that's in your experience. Some of you have already put some comments in there from the previous slide, but what do you still see happening in terms of obstacles and exclusions for people using medication? And you can start typing those in now. So somebody put cost, and I think, does that mean who pays for it? Like if it's Medicaid reimbursable or insurance reimbursable? And if that's the case, you can type back in. But if that's the case, there's things like prior authorizations and fail first policies that are really not conducive to people receiving the medication they need. When somebody put they could potentially exchange one dependency for another, and a drug is a drug mentality, very firm. I think if we look at addiction as a chronic condition, the same as diabetes or hypertension or cancer, heart disease, things that there's not necessarily a cure from, they can go into remission, but we don't. We don't have the same restrictions on medication for those chronic conditions as we do for substance use disorders or opioid use disorders. And so, it's like if it's doctor prescribed, if it is regulated, and it's administered to a person to address their substance use or opioid use disorder issues, then why is that any different from Lipitor or any other kinds of medications that people use for other chronic conditions? And I think, we need to have that mentality and that argument a little bit more, because the other thing is people say, well, it's okay if you're on medication as long as you taper off. And I've never heard anybody say that people need to taper off their Lipitor medication for their diabetes. So I think, it's, again, it goes back to stigma and which way, in what ways are we absorbing that stigma and then internalizing it and then using it on each other. And I think that that's something that really requires some introspective thought on that part. And this idea that replacing a drug with a drug, maybe changing that framework to replacing a drug with medicine is the way to look at that. Because there is value in medication that has been approved by the FDA. It's considered evidence-based practice and something that we cannot really deny the science of. There's more heat than light generated around this often, but it's based on people's preconceived ideas and opinions. And as far as I'm concerned, it's dangerous to have an opinion about science. Scientific fact is scientific fact. And someone says, well, if you have diabetes, you learn how to eat, eventually you get off the medication. Well, that's true for some, but not true for everybody. And so, yes, and we're not saying that people need to be on medication for the rest of their life. Again, it's a personal decision, and it's a decision that's best made with that person and their medical professional, as all health decisions should be. So, this isn't a black and white thing. It's not about all of this, all of that. It's a matter of having some kind of social acceptance about medication, some social acceptance about society, as it seems to fly in the face of certain recovery rituals and certain recovery customs that have been taught a long, long time ago that were not based on science because there wasn't the science available at the time. I'm looking just quick at some of the other things that are on here. And I can see that there's a variety of opinions on this, and I think that this is something that we need to be really, as a community, as a field, as a profession, we need to be really open about, to have these discussions where people can voice their opinions and concerns openly. But I also think we have an obligation to look at how we might be exacerbating stigma on others and on ourselves. So moving on, the next slide is really about peer recovery support services, and that's something that's been developed over the last 40 years, and I know it's really flourishing big time in Florida. And just, to talk about it briefly, we talked about recovery coaching, we talked about peer bridgers, we talked about peers who can facilitate support in educational groups, peer telephone support, ongoing support, all recovery meetings, which are a way of having a generic 12-step type meeting without any 12-step ideology. It's just using the structure of a 1-hour meeting of somebody leading and people sharing. And it can be about people from all walks of life, all substances, all behaviors, family members that can come and talk about recovery type issues. And then recovery community centers, which we talked about earlier, that are, again, flourishing all over the country. I don't know to the extent that they are in Florida, but I know there are a number of them in Florida, and the idea that there's an actual place, a bricks and mortar place, where people can go to access 12-step meetings, to access peer support, to access recovery dances, to access computers, to access a number of things that will help them continue to support their recovery. So we talked about harm reduction, and we talked about medication as it has really surfaced in the last few years with the opioid epidemic and the overdose epidemic. And I think that one of the things that that also has emerged really through the distribution of naloxone to arrest overdose deaths so many organizations, from harm reduction organizations to recovery community organizations to treatment organizations, have started issuing naloxone to clients and community members, to family members, to people who are actively using as a means of saving lives. And so the definition I have on this slide is that it's a philosophy and a public health approach. And if we think about the Surgeon General's report from 2016 called Facing Addiction, Alcohol, Drugs, and Health, one of the main tenets of that large document was that we needed to start addressing substance use and substance use disorders with a public health approach. And for many of us that are in behavioral health, that is not a pathway that we have really thought about in terms of what public health is, what it means, and how to address that. But harm reduction is definitely a public health approach. And it's also a philosophy because it refers to a range of services and policies that lessen the adverse consequences of drug use and protect public health. Unlike approaches that insist on people stop using drugs, harm reduction acknowledges that many people are not able or willing to abstain from illicit drug use, and that abstinence should not be a precondition for help. And I think for many of us, especially people who are in the treatment field or have been in 12-step recovery, myself included, that it was, it's like abstinence seemed to be the gold standard. And I think abstinence is a very, very important part in my recovery and a lot of people's recovery. But I'll tell you, when I was in early recovery in 1992 in New York City, one of the things I did as part of my service was needle exchange on the Lower East Side of Manhattan because people were dying of HIV/AIDS. And so we have a similar situation now where people are dying of overdoses. And, do we value those lives? And do we value people's lives that are still using drugs? Maybe they'll get to where we are. Maybe they won't. We talked about recovery capital. Maybe they have really low recovery capital. Maybe there's social determinants of health that are keeping them from their daily lives of getting to abstinence, and maybe they don't want to. So how can we help them reduce the harm and promote any positive change in their lives has been something that a lot of people have been thinking about in terms of we have a lot of people out there that are in pain, a lot of people that are at risk of dying, and what is our responsibility to them as well as all the other people that are practicing abstinence-based recovery. So I talked about any positive change. I talked about meet people where they're at, but don't leave them there. As a social worker, I'd always heard meet people where they're at, but I've never heard don't leave them there. And that really fleshed it out for me in terms of my social and moral responsibility to help move people along and help them figure out what any positive change might mean in their lives, and then help them figure out how they might achieve that. Setting, short-term, initially short-term goals and then long-term goals. That seemed akin to the recovery process to me. Harm reduction on the continuum of care, that we start consciously building that in to our continuum of care, that the way we designed the system before is for people that have had access to systems of care, and that harm reduction may create better access for people who have been left out of that continuum. There's been a lot of discussion about people with abstinence-based recovery interfacing with harm reduction and how that works, and how that works in terms of recovery communities and our responsibility, like I said, to be a part of a larger solution that maybe we previously didn't suspect. I started off by talking about naloxone distribution, but that continues. And, initially, when I was at SAMHSA, we talked about getting naloxone in the hands of first responders, EMS folks, fire people, police, and one of our arguments was that those systems and people definitely needed to have naloxone, but they weren't the only first responders, and that family members and people actively using and people in recovery were often first responders also. And then finally, I just want to talk about, there's another trend happening right now with peer support in emergency departments and in community outreach settings. And that's, come across largely as a result of the opioid epidemic, that people were coming into emergency departments with overdosing, and the medical staff did not know or were not equipped to be able to deal with them and support them in a way, and much less, like the impetus was pretty much just treat them and get them out the door. When you brought peer support workers into the emergency departments, you had a level of engagement that never happened before. And then you also had peer supporters that were educating the medical staff about the humanity of the people that were in there and what they deserved, and that things like terminology like frequent flyers and revolving door wasn't really helping anybody. That engaging them may reduce the recidivism that was happening with people coming into emergency departments with overdoses several times. So the new and emerging trend is happening in many states across the country, and really something to look at in terms of how lived experience and peer support workers are engaging as a recovery pathway guide in these new settings. So question is, what harm reduction activities does your community engage in to address the opioid epidemic? Are you doing naloxone only? Are you considering other things? Has naloxone opened doors that you didn't think were available or important before? What are some of your thoughts about this in terms of what you see happening on the ground in your community or in your agency or profession? So I see a smattering of naloxone distribution, some prescription drug take-back programs, the need for primary care to engage more, putting people in jail, which I get to the antithesis. And I don't know if there's jail diversion programs that are happening in Florida. Those are, another area of getting people into either neutral, safe spaces or treatment spaces before they're put in jail. Case management to address with appropriate services. EMS have been providing Narcan, and we have a local opioid task force attempting to educate and engage the community outreach. A lot of this really is community education, and it's just, I feel like in many ways we have an opportunity to look at things differently. So just like with the medication piece, there's new evidence and there's new ways of looking at things with what we know about social determinants of health disparities, and that there's pathways to look at that we haven't fully yet considered. And so someone did say they do have jail diversion programs. programs that have drug-free and MAR clients together. So it sounds like there's some things that are happening on the ground. Again, this is a period of immense change. And I would like to think that, the addition of recovery services, the addition of peer services, the addition of lived experience has changed this conversation at least a little bit. And I think, if we start talking more and more about recovery-oriented systems of care, what do we need to encompass, and what new system services and even ideologies do we need to encompass that we didn't before with what we know now? And so I think, a lot of this is going to be evolving. A lot of it is going to be, sort of setting our aspirational sights and figuring out what sticks and what doesn't, and sort of working through promising practices to practice-based evidence so that we can get evidence-based practice to really determine, what the best course of action of all this. But a lot of it just comes down to education. And I just know that a lot of things that I was taught was, outdated or even wrong, and I had to look at things in a very different way. And I just attribute my recovery as the impetus for that happening. It helped me develop an open mind and to say, well, if this isn't working, let's try something that will. And right now, we're in an epidemic, and we have people dying, and so we have to try everything we have in terms of recovery supports that'll maybe redefine what the problem is and come up with some new solutions. So, the final thing that I just wanted to talk about was digital recovery. And admittedly, I only have one slide on this because I know the least about this, and there's probably people in the audience that know way, way more, especially if there's young people. I do know that there's a program called In the Rooms, and I know that it was developed by Kenny and KT down in South Florida. It's been around for a good while. Started off as online 12-step meetings, and as their recovery consciousness has grown and they've incorporated many pathways, they're really open to all kinds of recovery digital meetings that are happening on their platform, and they're more than happy to take suggestions and advice for new ones that they don't host right now. So, if there's something that you think would be really beneficial, and something that would be beneficial to you or your clients or individuals in your community, think about reaching out to In the Rooms and talking about this really, really successful program. There's also, all those mutual support meetings I talked about. There's online meetings for all of those. And so for especially people in rural areas, if you can't get physically to a meeting, there's a whole, sort of virtual platform or a set of virtual platforms that you can connect with recovery community and recovery supports and specific recovery programs. And then, finally, recovery apps. And again, I really defer to most of the young people. I have apps on my phone that I've never opened, and I'm just of an age where I just don't find them useful. I wish I did, but it's not my go-to. But I know that for many, many people, there's hundreds of recovery apps, and some of them I think are very, very helpful. Some of them are very specific, and I think it's the wave of the future, and it's just something that we should not pay attention to. But I think you could probably do a whole webinar on recovery apps and have somebody who is well versed and really talk about this in a way that could really help you. So I'm just putting this out as a teaser, and it's a sort of a final thought. But I think, I am, even though maybe not completely tech savvy, I'm smart enough to know that this is something that's not going away and it's going to have more traction, and it's also going to evolve in terms of not just a viable recovery pathway, but probably a set of recovery pathways. So with that, I have a couple of resource slides, and these are things we've talked about. So it's the way that you can connect with this stuff online. I have some citations from the things I've talked about. And then my final slide is the one I use everywhere, that the renewed vision is that That recovery works, yes, recovery is possible, always, but the bottom line is that recovery is an expectation. And I think that we need to have that expectation for anybody out there that wants it, for anybody out there that wants it on their own terms, and we have the responsibility to help them define it and find a way to get there and collect the resources to help them achieve it. And so if we can do it, they can do it, but we have a full expectation that people are going to be engaged in a recovery process. So with that, I've talked a tremendous amount, and I am a little out of breath and hoarse, but I am more than willing to take individual questions now. So I see a bunch of comments. Yeah, as just handing out Narcan is obviously not the answer. I think, the thing about harm reduction, or even the peers in the emergency departments, is really the whole opportunity for engagement, and that person to person, face to face, you have a connection, you have an opportunity to engage in a way that you're not just administering Narcan and walking away, but you're actually starting to build a relationship. And that can happen immediately, initially, but it can also happen over time. Everyone should realize that apps are not really free. Anyone who uses apps gives up a tremendous amount of their information. That is often why they often ask to access your contact photos, etc. For a basic security message, if you do not use apps, delete them. Well, that's well taken. I'm going to do some activity on my phone this afternoon. And I think, I think that's true. There are social media in general is something to be wary of in terms of the kind of information that you give out, and the kind of information that you're giving people access to, sometimes without not really knowing it. I have been in recovery many, many years, and I love social media, and in the rooms is awesome. Great. Good recommendation. A personal relationship cannot happen via telehealth. I'm not sure that's true. Again, I think it's how people define it. People Skype and FaceTime and do all kinds of things now that we thought weren't conducive to counseling or coaching. And, again, I think it's having an open mind to new possibilities. But I understand. I understand that sentiment. I'm not. Somebody put Skyping it's still some face-to-face. Otherwise, it can be catfishing. I'm not sure what catfishing means. Somebody says, is NAR dangerous to early recovery? Clients nod out to the point of potential danger. If people are nodding out, I would really recommend a talk with the. I assume you're talking about methadone, that they talk about redosing to their medical professional, because I think that's a point of being heavily dosed in a way that could be dangerous. Using both in person and online. A few years ago, none of this was possible. True. I mean, I think there's all kinds of combinations with technology that we've yet to explore. And so, I think telehealth is something that it is a tool that is helping people in rural areas or people that are isolated able to connect. I think we should explore every facet of how they work and how they can work better. Oh, people who are in chronic pain but are opioid dependent. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really answer that. I think that there are people that have chronic pain that are on opiates to address their chronic pain. I think, again, that is something that is a medical decision, that even with an addiction counselor, it would be made with that person and with their practicing physician or physician assistant or whoever is prescribing the opioids for pain. Catfishing, that's pretending to be someone they're not. A TV show has been on cable and TV for years about such cases. Yeah, I think, buyer beware. I think always, we have to approach all of this with a sense of caution. And, it's like, and we live in an age of identity theft, and we live in an age where it's a whole new aspect of people that are not out for our best interest. But I think, that shouldn't preclude us not participating. I think we just have to start setting different parameters and figuring out how to do this cautiously and carefully. So, again, it's like technology isn't for everybody, but for the people that it benefits, I don't think we should exclude it or discount it. Well, the final thing is after recovery-based treatment, there is a lack of continued support in the community for those in recovery outside of typical AA, Celebrate Recovery, NA. More supports are needed to sustain the client in the community. Communities are not really recovery-oriented. So, that's sort of my premise from the very beginning, and I think it's actually not a bad place to end, is that, that beginning picture of good soil and good trees and what those resources look like. I don't know any community that has all of those, but I know communities that have half of them or 60% of them. I would like to see them be able to grow them out so that there's the network of supports for anybody or anybody. I think we have a long way to go. I think we have to figure out how to resource all of this, although I think much of it is cost effective, but it requires a different way of thinking. And if we want people to have sustained, good, holistic recovery, we have to start building the networks and supports to make that happen. So I'm with you there. And the final thing, your graphics and visuals for approaching the old topic with new input has been excellent. Thank you. I'll take that. I'll take that compliment. That's always nice to hear. This is replacing old stuff with some new stuff, and new stuff sometimes sticks and sometimes it's problematic, but it's new and we're going to try it out. All right, so we have another 10 minutes. Thought is reminding me. But I don't think it would be against the law to end a little early, would it? Oh, okay. What do you suggest communities do to accompany the Narcan giveaways? I think part of it is educating people who are carrying Narcan. And I think, people who are carrying Narcan are doing it out of a sense of responsibility and even, duty and obligation. I know a lot of people in recovery that carry Narcan. And I think part of it is, when you administer it, that you stay with the person. You know, like best practices is that you call the EMS, so they go to the emergency department. Sometimes they don't want to, but that's the best practice is to get them from where they are to picked up and gone to the emergency department so they can be medically looked at. And I think, you know, in all those moments you have an opportunity for engagement. You have an opportunity for discussion. That discussion isn't necessarily like, do you want to go to treatment? I think that discussion is more that, you know, it's like acknowledging that who they are as a human being, because they don't get that acknowledgement everywhere they go. And you know, just sort of doing a person-to-person check-in with them. You know, and I think that sort of demonstration of humanity is sometimes what we lack. And it's certainly what society lacks in terms of stigmatizing people who have problems with substance use disorders or addiction. And so, you know, I think we know better, and I think that we, you know, if we take that moment to at least acknowledge the personhood of that person who's using drugs, or is addicted to drugs, or is just overdosed from drugs, that's changing the story in a very significant way. And I think that's, you know, I consider that my responsibility. I would like everyone to consider that their responsibility, is because I've been on the other end, and I know what it feels like to have people look at you and talk about you, oftentimes to your face as if you weren't even there. And I think just the acknowledgement of somebody's personhood or humanity is way more significant than sometimes we think. So I think that could be a personal intention. I think that can also be a community intention. And so, you know, I think from harm reduction groups to recovery community groups to treatment agencies, we all have a piece of this, and we all have touch points with people who are experiencing, you know, some sometimes really horrible things in their life. And for me, that's where that sense of duty and obligation comes from. It's to whom much is given, much is required. And I know everybody doesn't feel that way, but I would like for people to start to develop a more compassionate understanding for addiction in general, and for the fact that it can happen to anybody, and that it does happen to people that we know and love. I'm certain your wish in life was not to be an addict. What would you really like to do with your life? These have been very helpful to me in dealing with that. So those are the kinds of conversations you're having with people. That's fine. You know, that's a conversation starter. You know, it's like even, you know, in recovery-oriented systems of care, we talk about changing the conversations with intake and assessments, and you start by just building relationship and having conversation and saying, you know, if you woke up tomorrow and could do anything you wanted with your life, what would you do? Sometimes people have never been asked those questions in their entire life. So to change that conversation and start asking conversations that may mean something to them, and may give them, just in that one question, an element of hope that they've never had in their life, could be a game changer. So I don't know if this question came up again because because I didn't answer it, or if it just came up again because Diane didn't catch it, but it's what the youth suggest communities can do to accompany the Narcan giveaways. I often, there's a lot of governor's task force and county task force and municipal task force about the opioid epidemic, and I would love to see more community people involved in that, more people from the harm reduction and recovery community, even, I dare say, active users on that, people that, to start bringing in some community voices on those expert panels and ad hoc committees to start talking about how we can start to affect community change. When I went to social work school, I was trained as a community organizer. So a lot of that is leveraging community resources and pulling different community stakeholder groups to work together in a way that may be happening in your communities, but I would imagine it's not happening to the extent that it could be. And I think, that's where, just bringing lived experience into those ad hoc task force and whatnot can maybe bring a different perspective that, I just know that when you bring sheriffs and police officers and treatment providers and people in recovery and harm reductionists and family members, and when you bring all those groups together, you get some really amazing synergy. First of all, bridging differences and gaps, but also helping people come up with some community solutions. And when we go back to that picture, most communities don't even know what recovery is. So to start to develop those recovery networks could be a radical change in many communities and could affect the wellness and livelihood of a lot of people, not just in recovery from addiction, but in recovery from lots of things. And then, this last comment is sort of the peer specialist movement, and I think this is always an ongoing concern, and I think it's really about everybody staying in their lane. Peer support specialists, peer support workers have a very distinct role in workplace settings and in the workforce in general. They are not licensed clinical professionals. They should not be. They're not junior counselors. They shouldn't be doing any of that work. And I think that's a systemic issue with the state, and it's also an agency issue. And that it's like the roles and responsibilities and duties of a peer support specialist are very specific. They're trained in very specific ways to complete those roles, and they should be trained to stay in their own lane. So if there's fusing going on, if there's merging going on, that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed on all levels, but it shouldn't be happening, and it doesn't have to happen.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your expertise. And we are going to go ahead and conclude this webinar if there is no additional questions. Okay. We're going to conclude today's webinar. Your browser will take you to an evaluation on VADA's website. If you want to receive CE credits on or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for webinars through our WebEx link and when you set up your profile in FADA's system. This helps connect your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email. The sender will be Messenger at WebEx. Evaluation will close at midnight on Thursday, April 25th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will generate as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day, and please hold for the evaluation.